Western democracies pay the price for avoiding China? The current state of Western democracies' relations with China. The past decade has seen a dramatic shift in the economic and political relationship between China and the Western world. In the early 2000s, China was still viewed as a developing nation with great potential for growth. However, as China's economy has boomed in recent years, its status as a global power has grown exponentially. This newfound power has brought about new challenges for Western democracies, who now must contend with a more assertive and confident China on the world stage. The most immediate challenge facing Western nations is how to deal with China's increasing economic might. For many years, China has been content to export cheap goods to the West while importing raw materials and advanced technology. However, as its own manufacturing capabilities have improved, China is now seeking to compete directly with Western companies in areas such as renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and electric vehicles. This is already having an impact on the West, as Western companies such as General Motors and Apple have been forced to partner with Chinese firms in order to gain access to their market. China's economic power is also being used to increase its political influence in other nations. For example, China is currently building massive infrastructure projects in Pakistan and Bangladesh, improving its relationships with these nations. China's growing power has also been used to project military force beyond its borders. This is the first time that a nation other than the United States has had such a capability. China's military expansion is also being used to assert its claims in the South China Sea. Chinese President Xi Jinping has been actively pursuing a campaign of economic reform, reduce corruption and waste. He has also consolidated power, becoming the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping has initiated an ambitious program of infrastructure development, particularly in the Western regions. China's economic reforms have been accompanied by a crackdown on corruption, a campaign to reduce poverty. Xi Jinping's political philosophy, referred to as Xi Jinping thought, is considered to be a new way of thinking about China and a break from the Marxist-Leninist ideology of previous leaders. Xi Jinping thought is said to be a combination of the leader's ideas and the theory of socialism with Chinese characteristics for socialism with Chinese characteristics that Deng Xiaoping had originally outlined. The history of the West's engagement with China since the Opium Wars of the 1840s, the West has been engaged with China. The West has always seen China as a potential market for its goods and a source of cheap labor. However, relations between the two have never been easy. The West has tried to force China to open its markets and accept Western values, while China has resisted these attempts. The most recent manifestation of this tension is the trade war that began in 2018, when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese imports in an attempt to get China to change its trade practices. This has led to an escalation of tensions between the two countries, with no end in sight. The history of the West's engagement with China is one of tension and conflict. The West has always seen China as a potential market for its goods and a source of cheap labor, but relations between the two have never been easy. The West has always had a tendency to try to impose its values on China, and China has always resisted. The most recent manifestation of this tension is the trade war that began in 2018 when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese imports in an attempt to get China to change its trade practices. The history of U.S.-Chinese relations began with a conflict between two ships in 1853. At the time, the West was very much interested in getting China to open its borders to Western goods and Western ideas. China had no interest in doing so, however, and in fact, closed itself off even more tightly than it had been before. The United States was joined by other Western nations in what became known as the Opium Wars, which eventually forced China to open its borders. The rise of China and its impact on the world since China began to rapidly grow economically in the late 1970s, its impact on the world has been significant. Today, China is the second largest economy in the world and is expected to overtake the United States as the largest within a few decades. This rise has caused concern among many Western democracies, who worry about China's authoritarian regime and its increasingly assertive foreign policy. The price of avoiding a clash with China is rising for Western democracies as Beijing becomes more assertive on the international stage. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made it clear that he wants his country to be a leading power in the world, and Beijing has been investing heavily in military hardware and expanding its influence in regions like Africa and Latin America. This has led to increased tensions with the United States and its allies, who are now struggling to contain China's growing power. In recent years, the economic and military rise of China has led to increasing tensions with Western democracies. As China becomes more assertive on the global stage, the price of avoiding a clash with them is rising. Western nations are increasingly being forced to choose between standing up to China or accommodating them. This is a difficult choice, as there is much at stake. On one hand, China is an important trading partner and source of investment. On the other hand, they are a dictatorship with a history of human rights abuses. They are also using a growing military to challenge the existing post-Cold War order. China is an emerging superpower in East Asia, which has been a source of tension with neighboring countries as well as the United States. The recent South China Sea arbitration case against China has deepened the tension. The United States has been trying to be both conciliatory and confrontational with China over the past decade, but it is not clear what effect this has had on China's behavior. Western democracies' response to China's rise. The rise of China has been a cause for concern for Western democracies. The country's economic and military power has grown rapidly in recent years, and it shows no signs of slowing down. Western countries have responded to this by increasing their defense spending and strengthening their alliances. They have also been working to improve their relations with China in hopes of avoiding a conflict. However, the price of avoiding a clash with China is rising. Western countries are being forced to make concessions on trade and other issues in order to keep the peace. They are also having to deal with an increasingly assertive China that is challenging them on the world stage. All of this is putting a strain on the relationships between Western countries and China. It remains to be seen how long these tensions can be kept at bay. China is also having to deal with a more assertive Russia. This is leading to an arms race that is costing both countries billions of dollars every year. These are funds that China and Russia could be spending on schools, roads, healthcare, and other domestic programs. The arms race is not just costing money, it is also causing political problems for both countries. China and Russia have an alliance with each other, but they are not allies. There are huge differences between the policies that China and Russia are pursuing at home and around the world. The costs of avoiding a clash with China. The original discusses how Western democracies are starting to pay a higher price for avoiding a clash with China, and it goes on to say that this is due to China's growing economic and military power. As China's economic and military power continues to grow, the costs of avoiding a clash with China are also rising for Western democracies. This is because these democracies are increasingly being forced to make concessions to China in order to keep the peace. For example, Western countries have been pressured to allow greater Chinese investment in their economies and to accept more Chinese refugees. The costs of avoiding a clash with China are therefore rising as China becomes more powerful. However, it is still cheaper for Western countries to avoid a conflict with China than it would be to fight one. Nevertheless, the US and its allies in the West should not assume that it is always cheaper for them to avoid a conflict with China than to fight one. If a war between China and the US broke out in the future, then it would be much more costly for the West to fight China than it was in World War II. The way forward for Western democracies. In recent years, Western democracies have been increasingly challenged by the rise of China. While some have responded by trying to engage with China, others have taken a more confrontational approach. However, as China continues to grow in power and influence, the costs of avoiding a clash with them are likely to continue to rise. In the long term, Western democracies will need to find a way to coexist with China without compromising their values or sacrificing their interests.